Okay, part 2 of chapter 1. This one's a little longer, this part. Let's hope it all gets on there. Okay. El Paso made history again on the night of March 19th, 1966 at the University of Maryland's Cole Field House in College Park, Maryland, when Don Haskins, the coach of the Texas Western Miners basketball team at El Paso, started for the first time in history an all-black lineup in the NCAA. The Miners upset the number 1 ranked University of Kentucky Wildcats, an all-white team, 72-65 for the national title. Mom loved college basketball and hardly missed a game at UTEP. The school had changed its name from Texas Western to University of Texas at El Paso in 1967. She often spoke of Don Haskins, said they were friends, and what a great man he was. I was never a sports fan, but now that I understand the significance of the history, I regret that I didn't listen more closely when I still had a chance to talk to her. Mom was a short, blonde, confident Texas liberal who adored Molly Ivins, the tart-tongued Texas journalist, and the witty Ann Richards, Texas's 45th governor. Besides her work as a teacher, she was also very involved behind the scenes of education and was an active member of the teachers' union, while also working tirelessly for women's rights through the National Organization for Women. Throughout her life, she was a constant advocate for children, women, the elderly, and the developmentally disabled, at work and as a volunteer. That woman knew how to volunteer. Mom was creative, capable, and could make anything she put her mind to. She was a wonderful seamstress and made most of our clothes until I was around 11, when I started making my own so that my clothes wouldn't have to match her and my little sister anymore. Between her guidance and the sewing classes at the Y, I became pretty good and started creating clothes for myself that I'd seen in the latest fashion magazines, styles that the local Sears or Montgomery Wards wouldn't carry. Our family lived on a tight budget and the money wouldn't have been there for trendy things anyway, so I made my own. Mom did all the right things technically to raise a healthy child. Balanced meals according to the latest food charts, extracurricular activities, and classes at the YWCA like sewing, macrame, ballet, and swimming. Girl Scouts at the Girl Scout summer camp, 6-month dental checkups. She read the right books on child rearing and gave me appropriate books for learning things about myself and my expected bodily functions as a girl. But Mom just never seemed to be happy. She wasn't a warm, fuzzy kind of mother, and as a kid, I felt more like a to-do list than a beloved child, and I didn't begin to understand her until I became an adult capable of seeing a bigger picture. In 1966, waves of people were seeking peace, love, and freedom through music, drugs, tolerance, and exploration. And yet there was still a tenuous hold on the days of the nuclear family. Mom making lemonade and cookies, Dad coming home from a hard day at work, to a cocktail, a hot homemade dinner, and an orderly house. 2 obedient kids, dog, station wagon, church on Sundays. At least that's the story we were fed on the 3 channels West Texas television programming provided. My family was nothing like that. Mom hated to cook, and she hated housework, preferring to spend her time on creative projects or community-driven events. And when he was home, Dad was always in his rock house backyard studio, dreaming up new ideas for art projects. My parents taught me to keep my eyes open to new ways of seeing and to see new things every day. We were always creating something or thinking about how to create something. My belief that anything is possible stems from those beginnings. We were quite bohemian by standards of the day in our neighborhood. My dad was 6'2" tall at that time, and most of the men of our neighborhood weren't over 5'10". None of the women were blonde like Mom, and none of them had a professional career. We had 2 cars when many of our neighbors didn't drive at all. We had a big black Doberman when they seemed to have little Chihuahuas. We had art depicting naked people on our walls. My friends' houses had Jesus on the cross and black velvet paintings of bullfighters and Elvis. We had a library full of books and the most recent Playboy on the coffee table next to Good Housekeeping and Reader's Digest. My parents were college educated and we weren't Catholic. We had Broadway music rolling out the windows. We had sculpture in the yard, and we didn't have a bunch of other kids of our own or an extended family running around. And we had a live-in housekeeper. In the 50s and 60s, many regular middle-class people around the country employed housekeepers. In El Paso, live-in help was extremely affordable and available, mostly due to the proximity of the border and the desperate poverty on both banks of the Rio Grande River. Nearly anyone with a regular income could hire help at home, but it wasn't common in neighborhoods like mine. There, some of the moms were the housekeepers. We had Lola. She lived with our family, took care of the house, took care of me, and cooked wonderful traditional Mexican food. Our house was filled with the aromatic smells of red chile sauce, cooking from scratch, and masa waiting to be patted into tortillas. The hiss and moisture of the steam iron, the murmur of Mexican soap operas on TV turned down low. She would dispense sage advice in Spanish on life and the practical ways of a woman to a young girl who only understood some of the words but absorbed the warmth and the meaning. A couple of times a month, Lola would take a few days off and walk back across the border to deliver the money she had earned to her family in Juarez just over the bridge. And then when it was time to return, the tiny 60-something-year-old Indian Mexican woman would sneak back across the border, having arranged a pickup point for my dad to get her on the Texas side. Or she would find another ride back to our house. On one occasion, she swam the river and walked the 3 miles in the middle of the night. I remember that night and waking up to a commotion to find my parents running around for dry clothes, a blanket, and something warm for her to drink, fretting while they tried to comfort and take care of her. Lola was more like a grandmother or an auntie to my sister and me. She was a source of comfort and security, and it never occurred to us what she gave up in her own family to care for ours. My friends' families always had a lot of action going on, cooking, cleaning, fighting, and caring for each other. We didn't do much of any of that. My parents were artsy and academic. They never argued or raised their voices, preferring to find separate projects in different parts of the house or yard when things weren't going smooth. On the weekends, we were always working on the house, tearing out a wall, tiling a bathroom, closing in a door, adding a window, paneling the living room with some weathered wood boards scavenged from the desert, digging a pond. I grew to dread those work days on the house. And the really weird thing is that both my sister and I went on to buy 100-year-old houses that require constant work. Besides our never-ending home maintenance projects and his work, Dad's passion was art. His studio was a 12 by 16-foot rock house in our backyard next to the concrete pad with rock columns that would have been a pretty good alternative for the master and his wives. There he had space for welding equipment, painting and sculpting supplies, construction supplies, and anything he might need for creating. Dad actually never thought of himself as an artist. He said he just did what he felt compelled to do, to create in whatever form came to mind. He did so many things well, but his best, most sensitive and revealing work was in his hand sculptures. An art show review by Joanne Quorum in the El Paso Herald, dated March 5, 1969, describes his work best. A multi-talented Tom Neyman is creative on stage, with paint, with metal, and with plaster. Of all his visual art, I like his hand sculpting best. For here what the artist reaches for, seeks to clasp, strikes out against, and clutches despairingly is told in a remarkable series of human hands which are, if anything, only too full of grace. Mr. Neyman's agonized, elongated skeletal figures are also interesting, and his head of actress Sally Summer is a fine portrait of her generous sensitivity. Still, the hands have it. They are what Tom Neyman does best. When Dad was home from work, he was either making changes to the home or working in his studio. I loved hanging out there, poking around the art supplies, or simply sitting on a stool watching while being bathed in thundering, soul-inspiring music, like the theme song to Zorba the Greek. Dad painted, sculpted, welded, and carved, using any and all materials at hand. One time when Mom and I came home from shopping, we were reminded of Dad's resourceful ways and how they influenced every aspect of our lives. After putting away the bags of groceries and pulling a load of wash from the machine, Mom headed out back to hang the clothes, only to discover that Dad had cut down the poles holding the clothesline. He had needed more raw material for a sculpture he'd been working on. Sometimes Dad would take me with him out into the desert to scavenge old abandoned building sites. Our transportation was an old electrician's truck from the 40s that we called Tobacco-Rhoda. We looked for weathered wood from dilapidated shacks, railroad ties and nails, or anything that appeared to have potential for Dad to use for painting frames, wall paneling, furniture, or other art and building projects. He would also look for old abandoned silver mines where we could quarry turquoise for jewelry and art projects. These forays gave me time to focus on the abundant life and slow humming energy of the desert world. I learned even more about paying attention to detail, in the way that ants did all things with focus and purpose, or how cold-blooded creatures preserved their strength for survival, how to make the most with what was at hand. Our house was perched on a big hill that was above two smaller hills and had a steep driveway. One day, Tobacco-Rhoda's emergency brake gave out and she rolled out the driveway, making a soft right, while continuing to travel 3/4 of the way down the first hill, where she jumped the curb and rolled further into and down the gravel ravine across the street from us. Dad somehow pulled her out and hauled her back to our house, parking the truck out back near the Rock House studio, where over time she slowly succumbed to the welder's torch while metamorphosing into art, including the cauldron of fire with the projecting hand that would eventually show up in Manos. I loved my family and loved our home. It was only when I went outside or invited someone over that I began to see how different we were from everyone else in the tiny circle of my neighborhood. And it wasn't just our color that made me stand out. My experiences at the neighborhood public school, Houston Elementary, are a perfect example of how different I was from the other kids. I was the subject of much taunting, mostly because I appeared so different from most of them, with my lighter skin and short hair. Some of the kids were restricted by their parents from associating with me because we weren't Catholic, so I became a convenient target for cruelty. One time, several kids pretending to be friendly walked along with me toward home after school. As we passed a bush with red berries, they stopped and pretended to eat a few, saying how delicious and sweet they were, and inviting me to try. The berries turned out to be some really hot peppers, and when I began to cry and rub my eyes, the juice blinded me. When I began screaming in terrible pain, they all ran off laughing, leaving me crying, till my vision cleared enough to find my way home, with blisters around my eyes from the pepper oils. Often, these same kids would say ugly things about me to each other in Spanish, right in front of me, not knowing that I understood the hurtful words. I kept that knowledge to myself, secretly thinking at least I had something on them. No matter what they did, however, I was always ready to forgive, looking for ways to make them like me. I never knew where I fit in, and was constantly trying to figure it out by reinventing myself. No one really knew who I would be the following week, and in retrospect, I'm sure that just made me seem much stranger. Although I felt like a loner much of the time, I did have one close friend down the street, a very pretty girl with long black braids named Yvonne. She thought I was okay, and so did her mom, so we were good. Yvonne was often pressured by the other neighborhood kids to ditch the weird white kid, but she usually resisted and kept hanging out with me. A few of the other girls were peripheral friends who came and went at whim. Mostly, I think they just wanted to see the inside of our house, or to see what I would do next. We didn't have a lot of entertainment back then, and kids get bored, so I was fair game. Dad had built a huge stereo cabinet that housed a turntable, and I told the neighborhood kids it was my grandfather's coffin. They would creep up to it until I would threaten to raise the lid, and they would run screaming. No wonder these kids thought I was crazy. My experience as a child at that particular time and place with my particular parents exposed me to as much as they had to offer. I was not sheltered as many of my friends were. Our house was only a 6-minute drive to the border crossing, and we would often go to Juarez for lunch or just to walk around. And later, as a young teen, I would ditch school and walk across the border to avoid getting caught. Although the local kids had no access to a bigger world, some of them never left the borders of El Paso and Juarez till they became adults. I was part of music and theater culture through my parents. Mom took me to the symphony and museums. She had season tickets to the El Paso Symphony, and a trip to the Santa Fe Opera was a favorite with her. We would go to the El Paso Museum of Art for new exhibitions, to galleries and art shows when my dad had his own work on exhibit. We went to the library most Saturdays to pick out and return books, and I remember always taking the maximum amount allowed, and Mom would say, "You don't have to read them all, but this way you don't have to be so choosy, and you might find new authors and stories that you like." To this day, there is nothing in the world to me like discovering a new and wonderful book. And of course, Dad introduced me to the theater. A born theater enthusiast, Dad lost no time after I moved to El Paso in getting involved in the brand new Festival Theater Company, which had opened its first production in April 1965. During the 7 years he was at the festival, he won Best Actor Award 4 times and played many roles, including Reverend Morel in Candida, Jamie in Long Day's Journey into Night, Mr. Lowther in The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie, R.P. McMurphy in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, Francisco Pizarro in Royal Hunt of the Sun, the narrator in Our Town, Jonathan Brewster in Arsenic and Old Lace, King Arthur in Camelot, and yes, he sang, Don Quixote in Man of La Mancha, and yes, he sang again, and King Henry IV in Henry IV. During the golden years of my dad's craft, he was well known in theater circles as one of the best actors in El Paso. Longtime El Paso entertainment journalist Joanne Coram described him in a 1970 article as a consistently brilliant actor, well trained in Stanislavski and Chekhov methods. Although he found his love for the stage while at university, he didn't take classes in acting, but he learned by doing and was cast as a lead in the very first play he auditioned for. He was a quick study and a natural at most things that he found interesting. Dad directed a number of shows, created set designs for others, taught acting classes to teens in 1970, and in 1971 took the paid position of resident director for the festival. He lived and breathed the theater, and so did I. Along with our desert scavenging sessions, the theater was one of the ways we spent time together. And as a kid, I attended numerous rehearsals and set building sessions, doing my best to stay out of the way so I would be permitted to keep coming back to help. I spent every moment I could in that theater and knew every inch of it by heart. In fact, when I revisited the Festival Theater, now the El Paso Playhouse, in 1910, it looked exactly the same as I remembered it. Backstage, dressing rooms, all of it, only smaller. I loved the look and the unique blend of smells of the theater: cut wood, paint, musty props, makeup, hairspray, sweat, all blended together into a comforting and yet exhilarating scent. Half-built sets, fabric for costumes laid out on the front two rows of seats, dog-eared scripts, and the expectant energy hanging over all of it. I loved the rehearsals and the bond that formed between the performers and crew, the laughter, camaraderie, pacing and practicing of lines together and alone. Hammering and nailing sounds punctuated by musical vocal exercises, the light and sound crew calling from the booth to the stage as they made adjustments. I conspired to be part of it all. To this day, I choke back tears of nostalgia when I enter a small community theater. To me, it was more home than home. I couldn't get enough of how Dad worked the stage while I watched from the light booth, the front row, or backstage. I learned to read by helping him run his lines. It never got old or tedious to me. Everyone at the theater seemed kind to me and all referred to me as Tom's daughter, a title I carried proudly, and it was a magical time for a little girl. Among the people I met at the festival, I remember two men who did much of the costuming. I knew them as Guy Rex, their business moniker. They also seemed to love my dad, and I remember Dad good-naturedly telling Mom he wished they would tone down the affection a bit, that people were starting to talk. As young as I was, I knew that they were different from the other men in my kids' world. They were flamboyant and fabulous, confidently embracing who they were and creating a beautiful world for themselves and those fortunate enough to come within their sphere. To me, they were bigger than life, and I was fascinated. Richard Guy and Rex Holt went on to become famous for mentoring young women vying for Miss Texas beauty pageant titles by piloting 5 Miss Texas USA winners to become Miss USA in succession from 1985 to 1989, inspiring the term the Texas Aces. No other state had won the Miss USA crown more than twice in succession, and they did it like no one else, in the style of the Broadway show My Fair Lady, by having the aspiring young women move in with them for a crash course on becoming a beauty queen. By spring 1966, my parents were getting involved in anything they could, socially and civically. They joined the Elks Club, ostensibly so I could go swimming, but it could have been for the cheap drinks too. Mom got into Girl Scout leadership in the PTA. Dad organized family night at the boys' club with local mariachi bands and homemade tamales, all the while immersing himself in his world of theater. But while my folks were kicking ass and hitting their stride, there began a slow implosion of their personal lives. It was the beginning of very confusing times for a kid, especially one with such keen observation. And it was during these times that Hal Warren walked on the stage of our lives with an idea and a dream. That's the end of chapter 1. Next chapter, starting tomorrow, is Enter Harold P. Warren. In the meantime, look in the comments on my Growing Up with Manos page, and you'll see links. You're probably wondering about some of the props and things around me, so I will talk about at least one a day. This is something that was sent to me from the Petty Peach, not pretty, Petty Peach on Etsy. And she made this for me, and she also has these all ready to go with Manos, with Torgo on them. So please go check her out, and it's a good time to support the artist. So thank you, and see you tomorrow.